It is all too easy to dismiss progressive ideas from socialism and internationalism to gender abolition and animal liberation as nonsensical utopian fantasies. Do you think that modern society and all its amazing components wouldn't seem like utopian fantasies for the vast, vast majority of human history? And yet here they are. Democracy, states, human rights, international trade networks, the rule of law. These are just a few significant modern ideas that would have seemed like utopian fantasy for the vast majority of human history. And yet all of these ideas are significant forces in the world today. Modern society could easily be regarded as an impossible utopian fantasy for the vast majority of human history. And yet here it stands. Progress is utopian, until it isn't. People currently argue that human nature makes socialism, internationalism, gender abolition, and animal liberation impossible. In the past, one could have easily argued that human nature made any semblance of mass democracy impossible. In the past, one could have easily argued that human nature made large-scale social organization into states impossible. In the past, one could have easily argued that human nature ensured that human rights would never exist as a serious concept. In the past, one could have easily argued that human nature ensured large-scale international trade would be impossible. In the past, one could have easily argued that human nature ensured the rule of law was an impossibility. But these nonsensical appeals to history have no weight. Things do not happen until they happen. And just because something has not happened does not mean it cannot happen. History has demonstrated that time and time again. Something can seem like impossibility for the vast majority of human history, only to eventually materialize. Radical ideas are utopian fantasy, until they are not. History has not been one unchanging tradition. Radical progressions and changes have occurred many, many times. Things which would have once seemed utopian have become perfectly real. Just because something has been the case doesn't mean it should be or has to be. Just because something hasn't been the case doesn't mean it shouldn't be or can't be. The appeal to history is incredibly illogical. The appeal to tradition is amazingly irrational. Appeals to history and appeals to tradition are circular and deeply idiotic. We should do that because we do that. We shouldn't do that because we don't do that. The logic is blatantly circular and laughably irrational. This kind of thinking doesn't make you a harsh realist. It makes you a mindless idiot. The appeal to history and appeal to tradition are cop-outs. They are arguments made by desperate idiots who are incapable of arguing that progress is undesirable, so they rely on illogical assertions that it is impossible. There is no good reason to believe that these irrationally desirable radical progressions cannot materialize. And I see no reason why we shouldn't try to materialize these irrationally desirable radical progressions. It is very funny because while the opponents of ideas like socialism and internationalism claim that these ideas are impossible, they seem to be intensely terrified of these ideas actually manifesting. The arguments they use are always laced with fallacious appeals to history and tradition, as well as blatantly illogical fear-mongering and straw-manning. And they are founded on a mixture of desperation and terror. Desperation to find the most coherent argument in a pool of irrational stupidity, and terror at the prospect of progress occurring. Deep down, many of them understand that it is possible, and that possibility terrifies them. To halt progress, they attempt to create a self-fulfilling prophecy that ensures its impossibility. Progress only becomes impossible when they manage to convince people that it is. Many of them almost certainly understand this, and for that reason eagerly promote the idea that progress is impossible. Progressive ideas only become impossibilities when we regard them as such. Nothing guarantees failure so much as the idea that failure is guaranteed. At work here is a powerful self-fulfilling prophecy. And it is a self-fulfilling prophecy that many on the political right eagerly attempt to propagate with various forms of argument, from appeals to tradition, nature, and history, to lazy fear-mongering and straw-manning. Those who label rational and realistic goals of progress as utopian fantasy stand in the way of rationally desirable societal progression. And why do they do this? Due to poor reasoning founded on deeply irrational appeals to history, tradition, and nature. People who claim perfectly realistic and rational ideas are utopian fantasies should not be viewed as harsh, rational realists. They should be viewed as irrational idiots, because that is exactly what they are. Out of desperation, people argue that progress is impossible, when they have no arguments for progress being undesirable.